January 21, 1793. A man climbs the steps of a wooden scaffold in the middle of Paris. He is not a criminal. He is not a soldier. He is not some nameless figure lost to history. He is Louis XVI, King of France, ruler of the most powerful monarchy in the Western world, heir to centuries of royal bloodlines, absolute power, and divine authority. And in just moments, he will be executed by his own people. History books will tell you the French Revolution was about liberty, about equality, about the rights of man, and they're not wrong. But there is a story beneath that story. A story that doesn't start in a palace or a parliament. It starts in a bakery. It starts with bread. Because before the guillotine fell, before the Bastille was stormed, before anyone shouted, Liberté, millions of ordinary French people simply could not afford to eat. And when hungry people have nothing left to lose, kings lose everything. To understand why France exploded, you first need to understand what France looked like just before it did. In the mid-1700s, the French monarchy sat at the absolute peak of European power. Versailles, the royal palace outside Paris, was not just a home, it was a statement. It was the most expensive building complex in the world, designed to project the infinite power and divine right of the French crown. Louis XVI inherited this empire in 1774 at just 19 years old. By most accounts, he was a decent man, quiet, bookish. He loved clocks, hunting, and metalwork. He was not cruel like some monarchs before him. He was not reckless or bloodthirsty. But he was completely, catastrophically unqualified to handle what was about to hit him. Because the empire Louis inherited wasn't just magnificent, it was broke. France had spent itself into ruin. Decades of European wars, colonial ambitions, and royal extravagance had created a national debt so large that just servicing it, paying the interest, consumed over half of the government's entire annual revenue, half, before paying for anything else. No roads, no army salaries, no food programs, just debt payments and the French tax system. It was a masterpiece of inequality. French society was divided into what they called the three estates. The first estate, the Catholic clergy. The second estate, the nobility. The third estate, literally everyone else. That meant roughly 97% of the French population. Here is the part that should make your jaw drop. The clergy and the nobility, the first and second estates, were almost entirely exempt from taxation. The people who owned the most land, accumulated the most wealth, and benefited most from the state, paid almost nothing into it. Instead, that burden was crushed entirely onto the third estate, onto peasants, onto urban workers, onto craftsmen earning barely enough to survive. And then, just to make it worse, nature showed up. The late 1780s were catastrophic years for European climate. In 1783, a volcanic eruption in Iceland, the Lackey eruption, sent so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it altered weather patterns across the entire northern hemisphere. Temperatures dropped. Harvests across Europe and North Africa failed. France was hit hard. Then came 1788, what the French would later call l'année de la misère, the year of misery. It started with a brutal drought in the spring that stunted crop growth across the country. Then, in July, came something almost biblical, a hailstorm so violent, so widespread, that it destroyed crops across an enormous swath of northern France in a single afternoon. Witnesses described hailstones the size of fists. Fields that had been green and promising in the morning were flattened, shredded, and ruined by nightfall. Then the winter of 1788 to 1789 arrived, the coldest in living memory. Rivers froze solid. Watermills, which ground the grain into flour, stopped working. Supply chains collapsed. Livestock died. By the spring of 1789, France was staring down the barrel of a full-scale food crisis. And at the center of it all was one commodity. One thing that every French person, rich or poor, depended on for survival. Bread. Bread was not just food in 18th century France. It was the caloric foundation of life for the working poor. The average French laborer consumed somewhere between 1 and 2 kilograms of bread per day, because there was often little else to eat. Think about that. Not bread as a side dish. Bread as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So when grain harvests failed, and flour became scarce, and bread prices spiked, it wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Here are the numbers, and they are brutal. In 1788, the price of a 4-pound loaf of bread in Paris, what an average worker needed to feed their family for a day, was roughly 8 sous. That's already significant for a laborer earning around 20 to 30 sous per day. By the summer of 1789, that same loaf cost 14 to 15 sous. In some reports, bread prices had risen by as much as 88% in less than a year, and wages? Wages didn't move, because they almost never do in a supply shock. Workers were still earning 20 to 25 sous a day, if they could find work at all, because the economic collapse had also devastated employment. So now do the math that millions of French workers were doing every single morning in 1789. You earn 20 sous a day. Bread for your family costs 14 sous. That leaves 6 sous for rent, clothing, firewood, and everything else it takes to stay alive. It was mathematically impossible. There was no way to make it work, no clever budgeting, no cutting back. There was nothing left to cut. Historians estimate that by early 1789, the average French worker was spending somewhere between 80 and 90% of their total income just on bread alone. In modern terms, imagine if your rent, your car, your health care, your children's needs, all of it, had to fit into whatever was left after you spent 85% of your paycheck at the grocery store on one item. This wasn't poverty. This was engineered desperation. A pressure cooker with no release valve? The French monarchy was aware that it had a fiscal problem. Louis XVI had actually made several attempts at reform throughout the 1780s. He appointed reformist finance ministers, brilliant economists like Turgot and Necker, who came to the king with the same diagnosis every time. Turgot, appointed in 1774, was perhaps the most visionary. He told Louis XVI exactly what needed to happen: tax the nobility, end the exemptions, bring the first and second estates into the tax base. It was simple arithmetic. It was the only path to solvency. The nobility revolted. Not in the streets, in the salons and in the courts. They used every lever of aristocratic power available to them to block the reforms, sabotage the reformers, and protect their privileges. Turgot was dismissed in 1776. His reforms died with his tenure. The cycle repeated. New finance minister, new reform plan. Same noble resistance. Same dismissal. By 1789, France had burned through finance minister after finance minister. The treasury was so desperate that the government had begun borrowing money at ruinous interest rates just to pay off older loans, the 18th century equivalent of taking out a payday loan to pay your credit card bill. When Necker, the most popular of these ministers, published the government's accounts in 1781, he did something extraordinary. He faked them. Or more precisely, he published a version of the accounts that hid the true scale of military and court spending, showing a surplus that didn't exist. It was financial theater designed to maintain confidence in French bonds. When the truth came out, it destroyed whatever credibility the crown had left. And meanwhile, in the streets of Paris, people were starving. The monarchy hosted lavish banquets at Versailles. Marie Antoinette's spending on clothing, gambling, and entertainment became the stuff of outraged legend. Whether entirely fair or not, it was a PR catastrophe in a country where people were choosing between eating and heating their homes. The disconnect was not just political. It was almost cosmically offensive. On July 14, 1789, a date every French schoolchild still memorizes, a crowd of Parisian workers, artisans, and soldiers stormed the Bastille fortress. You've heard this story. But here is what is often left out of the dramatic retelling. The Bastille storming was not a planned political coup. It was not orchestrated by philosophers or politicians. It was driven by fear and by hunger. Rumors had been spreading through Paris for days that the king was massing troops outside the city to crush the growing unrest. People were terrified, and they were starving, and they were furious. The crowd that stormed the Bastille was looking for gunpowder to defend themselves. It was a defensive act born of desperation, not a coordinated revolutionary strike. But what it triggered was something far larger than anyone in that crowd could have imagined. 3 months later, in October 1789, came one of the most remarkable events in revolutionary history, and one of the most underappreciated: the Women's March on Versailles. On the morning of October 5th, a crowd of Parisian market women gathered at the city hall. They had gone to buy bread, and once again there was none. Or whether was cost more than they could pay. These women, fishwives, market vendors, laundresses, seamstresses, began to march, not to a nearby government building, not to a local magistrate. They marched to Versailles. 12 miles in the October rain, some of them armed with pikes, knives, and cannons they had seized from the city hall. 7,000 women made that march. 7,000. They arrived at the Palace of Versailles, the most magnificent, most fortified symbol of royal power in the world, and they demanded bread. The king, faced with this unimaginable scene, agreed to their demands. He signed the revolutionary decrees he had been delaying. He agreed to return to Paris with the crowd. And the next morning the royal family was escorted back to Paris, not in triumph, but surrounded by the women who had marched, while the crowd carried the heads of the royal guards on pikes. The King of France was now effectively a prisoner of his own capital. Bread had done what armies could not. Now, step back for a moment. Because what was happening in France in the 1780s wasn't just a food crisis. It was a full-spectrum economic implosion, and understanding it tells us something profound about how economies can unravel and why ordinary people eventually reach a breaking point. France in the 1780s was suffering from what modern economists would recognize as a toxic combination of supply-side shocks, fiscal irresponsibility, currency debasement, and structural inequality, all hitting simultaneously. The supply shock, the harvest failures, drove up food prices. That's basic economics. Less supply, same demand, higher price. But France's fiscal situation meant the government had almost no tools to respond. In a modern economy, a government facing a food crisis can subsidize food prices, release strategic grain reserves, import grain from allied nations, or use monetary policy to manage inflation. France in 1789 had essentially none of these options. The treasury was empty. The government's credit was so destroyed that it couldn't borrow. It had already tried price controls on grain in the past, what they called the grain police, and the results were disastrous, driving grain off the market entirely. And here is the staggering geopolitical irony that makes this story even more extraordinary. France had just helped the American colonies win their independence from Britain. The American Revolution of 1776? France bankrolled a significant portion of it. Motivated by a chance to weaken their British rivals, France had spent an estimated 1.3 billion livres on the American Revolutionary War, money it did not have. France funded the birth of American democracy, and that expenditure helped bankrupt the French monarchy. The ultimate historical irony, the ideals of liberty and popular sovereignty that America proclaimed in 1776, ideas that French soldiers brought home with them, ideas that French intellectuals had helped shape, were now being turned against the French crown itself. France exported revolution to America, and then imported it back. By 1792, the revolution had moved well past bread prices and fiscal reform. It had become something far more radical, far more violent, and far more ideological than anyone in those early bread riots could have predicted. The royal family had attempted to flee France in June 1791, a catastrophic miscalculation that destroyed whatever sympathy remained for the king. They were caught at the border town of Varennes and brought back to Paris in humiliation. Louis XVI was now not just a weak king, he was a traitor in the eyes of the revolutionaries. In September 1792, France abolished the monarchy entirely and declared itself a republic. In December, Louis XVI was put on trial before the National Convention. The charges were not about bread. They were about treason, about conspiring with foreign enemies, about betraying the French people. But those charges had roots that ran all the way back to an economic system that had starved its own citizens while protecting the privileges of the elite, to a government that had taxed the poor into destitution while exempting the rich, to bread prices that had made ordinary survival impossible. On January 20, 1793, Louis XVI was found guilty by a vote of the National Convention. The margin was not overwhelming, but it was enough. The next morning, January 21st, he was taken to the Place de la Révolution, now called the Place de la Concorde, in the center of Paris. He tried to address the crowd. He said he died innocent. He said he forgave those who had brought him to this. And then the blade fell. Louis XVI was executed. Marie Antoinette followed 9 months later. The reign of terror that followed claimed thousands of lives. Nobles, clergy, and eventually the revolutionaries themselves began turning on each other. France descended into years of chaos before Napoleon emerged to impose a new order. But here's what should stay with you long after this video ends. The French Revolution is not just an 18th century story, it is a template. A warning. A recurring pattern in human history that has replayed itself across centuries and continents. When food becomes unaffordable. When the gap between the wealthy and the poor becomes obscene. When governments are captured by elite interests and become incapable of addressing ordinary people's needs. When fiscal irresponsibility meets environmental crisis meets structural inequality. Something breaks. The Arab Spring of 2010 and 2011, which toppled governments across North Africa and the Middle East, was ignited in large part by a spike in global food prices. The same basic mechanism, bread too expensive, people with nothing left to lose. The Weimar Republic's hyperinflation in 1920s Germany made currency worthless, wiped out the savings of the middle class, and created the political conditions in which an Austrian ex-corporal named Adolf Hitler could rise to power. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Argentina, the story of economic mismanagement, inflation, and political collapse has written itself over and over in different languages, different geographies, different centuries. What makes the French Revolution unique is not that it happened. It is how completely and violently the reckoning arrived, and how the very mechanics of it, the bread prices, the supply shocks, the fiscal ruin, were so mundane, so domestic, so economic. No foreign army destroyed the French monarchy, no plague, no natural disaster took the king's head. A bad harvest did. Combined with a century of broken economics. There is a version of the French Revolution that is about ideas. The Enlightenment, the rights of man, Rousseau's social contract, Voltaire's skepticism, the philosophical underpinnings of modern democracy. All of that is true and all of that matters. But ideas don't topple governments on their own. Ideas need fuel. And in France in 1789, the fuel was hunger. Rousseau could write about liberty all he wanted in the salons of Paris, but it was the market women of Paris, the fishwives and bread sellers, the women who stood in queues in the cold watching prices go up while their children went hungry, who actually made the revolution happen. They didn't have philosophy, they had rage, and they had nothing to lose. This is the uncomfortable economic truth at the heart of French history. Political revolutions are often, at their core, economic events wearing political clothing. The guillotine did not fall because of philosophy. It fell because bread cost too much. The monarchy did not collapse because the ideas of the Enlightenment were compelling enough to convince people to risk their lives. It collapsed because those ideas gave language and direction to a rage that had been born in something far more primal. In hunger, in the fear of watching your children go without food, in the daily humiliation of working your body to exhaustion and still being unable to put enough on the table. That is what brought down the most powerful monarchy in the Western world. That is the inflation that killed a king. Louis XVI was 38 years old when he was executed. He had spent his entire adult life trying and failing to reform a system that was structurally designed to resist reform. He was not a monster. He was, in many ways, a victim of the same broken system that victimized millions of his subjects. But he was also its symbol. And in times of crisis, symbols pay the price. Today, France is a democracy. The republic born in those bloody years has survived, transformed, reformed, renewed, for over 2 centuries. And France has one of the most robust systems of food price protections in the world. A deep cultural reverence for bread. The baguette is literally protected by French law. The price of bread is something the French government has historically been careful never to ignore. Because they remember, Or at least the history remembers for them. If you want to understand power, real power, how it accumulates, how it holds, and how it falls, don't start with armies. Don't start with philosophy, start with what's on the table. Or what isn't. If this story made you think differently about economics, about history, about how the world actually works beneath the surface, then subscribe, hit the bell. Because this channel is dedicated to exactly this kind of story. The real mechanics behind the events that shape civilization. Next time, we re-looking at how the British East India Company became more powerful than most governments on Earth, and what its collapse tells us about corporate power today. You won't want to miss it.